Okay, he asks, what was the change to the history curriculum that I mentioned the other day at the seminary? So we've had church history 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the MDiv. And 1 was early church, 2 was Middle Ages, 3 was Reformation all the way to the modern day, and 4 was Lutheran Church in America. And so we essentially changed it so that medieval is no longer a required course, and Church 2 is now Reformation era, from essentially late Middle Ages up until Formula of Concord. And then Church 3 is 1580 to the present. And then Church 4 is still Lutheran Church in America. But what that allowed me to do is I'm teaching the Church 3 class, and that allows me to spend about 5 weeks on Orthodox Lutheranism, confessional Calvinism, post-Tridentine Roman Catholicism, Pietism. So all the things that I think are much more interesting than modern theology. And then the last half of the course is all the bad modern theology. And it's actually, I thought it was a really good way to do it. And the students some of the comments they were saying, now after taking this class, I finally understand my previous unchallenged assumptions. Like I used to think this way, and this was just the normal way of thinking, and now I realize that I was just influenced by all these 20th century theologians. So that was fun. Let's see, chapter 5 of Balduin's book deals with the distinction of sacred doctrines between open and hidden. And this is also where he talks about kind of using logic to derive doctrines. And he's got a number of these, but I didn't write down all of his examples, unfortunately, so I'd have to go back and do that. But as you can see, you can conclude from the genus from a species, antitype from the type, lesser from the greater, greater from the lesser, effect from the cause, cause from the effect, one contrary from the other, and the antecedent from the consequent. Now, the problem is, without good examples showing you how this is done and showing you illegitimate examples or examples where it should not be done, I'm afraid that this is probably liable to a lot of abuse, to use logic in this way. For example, if you've got a category, let's just think in terms of a Venn diagram. You might have a Venn diagram, and you've got this category, and then you've got an example or a species within the genus. And you're going to posit, you're going to say something, or you know something about the species, and then you're going to then conclude something about the genus. Well, that might not hold true for all the other members of the genus. Okay? So, I don't know. I'm trying to think of some good examples, but nothing's really coming to mind right now. But I think you just have to be careful with how these are used. If you were going to, exegetically, if you had an example of a specific example, and you knew already that this specific example also applies to the genus, then you could, of course, draw a doctrine from that. I'm trying to think of some examples here, just from logic, if from nothing else. Oh well, I should have thought about it earlier, and I didn't. Let's see. So I think, do we have a whole lot more here? Those are the useful applications that he talks about. We'll talk about more. Okay, so now we get to actually look at some examples of how he does this in his book, The Apostolic Agenda. Let's stop this. I'm going to pull up a different document. Okay. So this is his Apostolic Agenda. I don't know how well you can see it. Not too well. I'll zoom it in here. The Apostolic Agenda is his commentary on Titus. So I picked this section at random just to show you what he does. He starts with the text of the epistle in Greek on the left with his translation on the right. and goes through a section of the text. Let's see here. After that, he's got an analysis and explanation of the second part, or of this section. So this is the section that says, "For this thing I left you behind in Crete, that you might continue to correct what things were lacking and appoint presbyters in every town as I had commanded you." And then he's got the characteristics of a bishop: blameless, husband of one wife, etc., holding fast to what is according to teaching, faithful discourse. A certain man from among them, a prophet who is one of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." So that's the passage that he's commenting on. So essentially, this is really in its genre. This is an epistle of St. Paul. It's already very doctrinal. Just in and of itself, it's got a lot of just straight up teaching that's directly applicable to life in the church. So in some ways, this is a pretty easy text to derive doctrines from, and might not be the best example, but maybe after this is done, we'll do what one of the Mummy brothers recommended and take up the gospel for this coming week and this coming Sunday and see what doctrines we can derive from that. But I'll just show you what he's doing here. The section here where he's got the analysis and explanation is where he is essentially explaining the text. It's paraphrased, but also explaining the doctrine that's in there. He brings in other passages of Scripture to talk about what's going on. He has a lot of explanation of ancient, he draws a lot from the classics. So he's got a lot of explanation from the various ancient geographies or various other texts. And let's see. So I've highlighted some parts that I thought were interesting. By the word presbyters, he means any teachers of the church, whether they be bishops or priests or deacons, for these titles are applied indiscriminately in Acts 20, where those who are called presbyters in verse 17 are later in verse 18 called bishops, or in verse 5 of this chapter they are called presbyters, who in verse 7 are called bishops. And then he next down here, he's got this example. Titus is supposed to appoint ministers of the church throughout all the towns of that island, just as if he were the highest president and inspector of those churches. And this appointment should be done by instruction in the true faith, by calling, by ordination, by inspection or governance. So he's unpacking the text here. It's what you would kind of expect in a commentary that they should explain these things. Let's see here. He explains really every part of it, what it means to be the husband of one wife. A bishop should not be polygamous or one who has many wives at the same time, whether they are all receiving his intercourse or some have been divorced. Because among the Jews it was not uncommon when they would often give their wives a writ of divorce for a trivial cause, etc. So Paul did not admit a man of this sort to the ministry of the word on account of the scandal and the example of the Gentiles, which that could easily have imitated. Talks about what happens if your kids are bad. You know, are you like kicked out of the ministry because you've got some kids that fell away from the faith? He says no. But if you have not raised them the right way, then you should never have been admitted into the ministry in the first place. And if you did raise them the right way, they went their own direction, and you have not condoned that, you've not approved of that, then you're fine. But he would say that if you're basically kind of being lenient to them and you're not taking it seriously, then that would be cause for removal of the pastor. Now, here he gets into questions from this part of the chapter, and this is where he especially will deal with apparent contradictions or questions that might arise as you're reading the text. Because Titus was left in Crete in order to correct the things Paul had left unfinished, it is asked whether bishops have the power of establishing new laws in the church. So a lot of these will also deal with misunderstandings of the text that come from opponents. This would be, of course, a more Roman Catholic position that the bishops can just make laws on their own without the consent of the church. This is the new commentary on Titus and Philemon by Friedrich Balduin, published by Emmanuel Press. Title is Apostolic Agenda. Yep. Question 2, because Paul makes separate mention of presbyters and bishops in verses 5 and 7, it is asked how presbyters should be distinguished from bishops. So this is actually dealing with a doctrinal topic. How is it that pastors and bishops, are they different at all? He gives his historical summary of that and says, by human law they have different duties, but not really by divine law. Question 3, can it be rightly inferred from the fact that Paul orders Titus to establish presbyters through every single town that the election of ministers of the word is in the power of the bishops alone? He says no, it's not. But he doesn't draw it from that particular epistle. He's drawing in his proof from Acts, essentially, where with the election of Matthias as the replacement apostle included all the people, and when they made deacons, they used all the people for that too. Question 4, why does Paul require of a bishop that he be the husband of one wife, although elsewhere he writes, I want you all to be like myself, that is, celibates? So that again would be more of a polemical issue with the Roman Catholics. Question 5, the apostle requires of a bishop that he have faithful children, not wanton or disobedient. It is therefore asked whether someone might be unfit for the ministry on account of evil children. Okay, so this gives you an idea. In all of these, he's dealing with questions that arise from the text that there have been debates over, and he's going to try to resolve these debates. Then the last part is especially where he does his doctrinal or dogmatic exegesis, theological aphorisms from this part of the chapter. Some of the epistles, some of the chapters might have been a better example of this for you than this particular chapter. Because this chapter is so doctrinal in the first place, a lot of these doctrines that he's derived from the text, it's the exact same as just reading the text. But as we go through here, we might see some that are not what you would necessarily have seen right away as you're reading the text. First, it is the role of a faithful teacher of the church to correct the defects of his hearers. Okay, it says that Titus is supposed to do that, but the doctrine that he's deriving from that is all the pastors are supposed to do that, not just Titus. Let's see. 2, lest the ministers of the church should take it badly if they have labored and others share in the reward and the honor, let it be done in a way with utility for the church. This is essentially talking about the concord of ministers. This has the greatest importance to the concord of ministers, lest any should envy the labors of another, if by chance one shall have labored with greater praise and fruitfulness than others, that they should in all things give greater attention to the common good. And this is derived from the fact that Paul started the church there in Crete, but now he's left it to Titus to take care of. So in a sense, Paul had maybe the tougher task, and Titus now has an easier task. Paul has maybe the more glory because he was the one who started it, but now Titus is following and doing. But anyway, that fact that Paul left Titus there brings him to the doctrine that within the church there's going to be ministers who have different gifts, different duties, and yet everything needs to be harmonious and in peace and concord among the ministers, despite the fact that there are differences. So that's the doctrine that he gains from that. Third, it is a matter of great labor to restore a corrupted church, not the work of 1 year nor of one man. So Paul joins Titus to himself as a co-worker in establishing the church of the Cretans, and joins to Titus other fellow priests, but acknowledges that all the vices have not yet been cut to the quick, but leaves to his successor too something that needs to be corrected. Let no one marvel then if churches that have collapsed are not immediately restored in a brief time. Okay, so what are you guys seeing here in the way that he's drawing the doctrines? Anything that you want to notice yet? Yeah.
Were others doing this similar kind of thing? And when did commentaries kind of stop doing? It seems very helpful laid out this way and to work through it this way. So were others doing it, and then when did it kind of fall out of practice?
I'm not really able to answer that. I know that there were different kinds of commentaries of different styles that were done in the 17th century as well as the 16th century. Some were more grammatical and really didn't get into this kind of thing quite so much. And others were, there was a variety of different kinds of commentaries. My guess, if I was to shoot from the hip, is that when you start having the biblical criticism of the Enlightenment, which is later 1600s, is when that really starts to get going, not so much among Lutherans, but among the French and among the Dutch. And then the Lutherans in Germany start to do all this terrible stuff in the 1700s. Then the Lutheran response becomes very apologetic at establishing the truth of what the Bible text says. And possibly somewhere along the line in that effort to really emphasize the truthfulness and the historical facticity of what's set forth in the Scriptures, some of this other stuff gets left behind. That's a guess. But I do know, though, that, so I read this book, and it was about Bible prefaces for printings of Luther's Bible in Germany. Lots of different prefaces for Bibles were published, and at Luther's time, and in the 16th century, a lot of them dealt with the distinction of law and gospel, for example. In the 17th century, a lot of them started to deal with the uses of Scripture and not so much with law and gospel in particular. And then towards the end of the 17th century, they just about all become apologetic and talking about the truthfulness of Scripture and just really leaving behind the application or usefulness of Scripture, because it was such a pressing need to try to just establish that these Scriptures are true. So that's what I can answer to that. There's probably a whole lot more that needs to be said about it. Yeah.
Is that, you suggested that pietism may not arise so much from the dryness of orthodoxy. So I was wondering to myself, well then what, historically speaking, what does pietism grow up out of, and would that be it? This sort of impulse to defend without application?
Well, certainly pietists did the same kind of defense of the text as the Orthodox did. But no, I mean, pietism was a reaction against orthodoxy. It's just that it really gets going in Germany around 1675. And actually after 1675. 1675 is Spener's Pia Desideria, his pious desires. And there's already a lot of time that had gone on with the Orthodox Lutheranism before the pietism really gets going. People still debate what it was really all about. I like to emphasize that there were different kinds of pietism. They were all, in a sense, a reaction against the reigning form of churchly Lutheranism. And some wanted things to be reformed, not in a like confessional Calvinistic sense, but to be changed and made better in various different ways, usually with more, well, people saw, okay, people aren't being sanctified, people are living evil lives, and we need to really take this seriously. And especially after the 30 Years' War, where you've got the ravages of war and all kinds of immorality, people are really wanting to restore the church to some kind of better state than what it was. And so it was, in general, a reform movement against what was considered to be an ossified, dry, non-living church, and trying to inject either new life into it, or in the worst cases, trying to find life away from it and being separatistic. Yeah.
How much was it a response to rationalism?
Well, really, pietism was getting going at the same time as rationalism was, in Germany. And so it's not so much that the pietism was reacting to the Enlightenment as it was that both things are going on at the same time, and they're both actually, for a time, the pietists and the Enlightenment folks were kind of teamed up to try to break the authority and the power of the Orthodox Lutheran churchmen. And you see this in Leipzig around 1679-ish, somewhere around there. Spener is in Dresden. He is superintendent of churches. He's court preacher for the elector. And he's got a whole bunch of followers there in Leipzig, and there starts to be student revolts. And the students aren't going to classes, or if they they refuse to go to classes if it's one of the Orthodox professors. And they refuse to go to the churches of the Orthodox professors. And they only want pietists as their teachers who are going to preach to them, I don't know, heartfelt, meaningful types of messages. And people start to become very anti-intellectual, and they don't think, it's like Karlstadt all over again. So you remember with Andreas Karlstadt, he wants to be called Brother Andreas. He doesn't want to have any titles or doesn't want to be called doctor, and looking for the Spirit in his heart and things like that. So that's really what made people, were very concerned about that. The Lutherans, Orthodox, previously were very appreciative of Spener and his approach, that like a lot of people thought that the Pia Desideria by Spener was a really good book and had some good points to it. But after what happened in Leipzig in the 1670s, later 1670s, that's when the divide really started. And in Leipzig, it was Reimarus, I think it was Reimarus, one of these earlier Enlightenment thinkers that was friends with Spener and with August Hermann Francke. Not that they really saw things theologically the same, but they wanted to destroy the authority of the strictness of the Orthodox Lutheran Church. And so they're teamed up for a while. Then the Pietists realized, oh my goodness, these guys really want to destroy everything. And so later on, actually, the Pietists and the Orthodox were more allied with each other against the Enlightenment folks. Anyway, that's a digression, but it was fun. That's what I was lecturing on this past spring. There's a good book that you should probably get, and it's in it's from the Classics of Christian Spirituality. I think that's what the series is called, and it's just the Pietists. And if you get that, it's got all of the main writings. Most of us that went through the fort read Spener's Pia Desideria, and most of us were like, hey, this doesn't sound so bad. Maybe it's got some problems, but it's not so bad. And maybe I was wrong in thinking that, or maybe I'm a pietist, who knows, Well, then what you find out is that most people didn't have too many problems with that book, and it was really later on that the pietist movement really got going. But that book that I told you about also has a lot of writings by August Hermann Francke, which are much more radical than what Spener was doing. And that's really where you get this, the classic pietism that we all know and hate is from Francke. But really the early, what's that?
A bunch of his hymns in our hymnal?
Francke?
Yeah.
I don't think so. We might have.
That was Salomo Francke, I think is what we have.
Not the same Francke. Is that what you're telling?
August Hermann Francke is the bad guy.
There's a Johann Francke and a Salomo Francke.
I'm sure those guys are fine.
There are a couple hymns by radical pietists. The Jakob Schütz 819 and Gottes Gegenwärtig.
So the early Missouri Synod actually didn't have really any problems with the churchly kind of pietism. They did have problems with the radical type of pietism, the anti-churchly pietism, the non-sacramental pietism. That they didn't like. But Spener's kind of churchly pietism, the early Missouri Synod was fine with. And even I found out while I was working on some of the debate between the early Missouri Synod, well, it wasn't Missouri Synod at the time, it was the Saxon immigrants and the Prussian immigrants with Grabau over there in Buffalo, New York, is that the Saxons, got their doctrine of the ministry from Spener's book, The Spiritual Priesthood. And they admit it. They say right there, we got all this from Spener. So they're following right along with Spener for the Missouri Synod, what became the Missouri Synod doctrine of the ministry and of the priesthood of all believers and all of that. Spener, The Spiritual Priesthood. And it's in that book, the Pietists. You can read most of it in there. So, and I'm not saying that Spener, what I'm trying to say is not that Spener is all wrong. I'm just saying there's really a lot of different kinds of pietism. And the churchly kind of pietism, you would probably look at that and say, the most orthodox of you, except for maybe Adrian, I'm not sure, would probably say, this is fine. But sorry to pick on you there, brother.
I wasn't the only one smoking cigars last night.
Okay, so getting back to Balduin, what he's doing here is he's taking the text of the Scripture, he's deriving doctrines from it. Sometimes it's just the example, that the example of what Paul did teaches us something that ought to be done now. Or the care with which Paul approached the church teaches us about the care with which pastors today should approach the church, that sort of thing. Some of these are just very straightforward. The ministry should not be entrusted to just anyone who pursues it, but he should be of the most proven morals, and as our Paul says, anenkletos, blameless. Okay, well that's literally what the text says, so that's a very easy doctrine to derive there. Okay, obviously it's permitted for ministers of the church to live in marriage. I don't think any of us would have any problem finding that from the text. We should raise our children aright. In verse 7, I think that's pretty clear from the text. Now this is something that is actually more of a derivation. Because the life of ministers of the word ought to be distinguished by many virtues, which our apostle enumerates with an extended catalog, the price of the work is that those who aspire to the ministry be especially accustomed to those virtues from youth. So if it's necessary for pastors to be a certain way, we shouldn't just let people grow up however they want, but we should actually be raising young men, boys and young men, so that they will fit with these characteristics so that we will have pastors in the future. It's kind of the same argument that Luther made when he wrote about how important it is to have schools. Another thing that I've pointed out, noted anyway, to myself, maybe not spoken about it, is that the epistles, the pastoral epistles say a lot of things that are supposed to happen in the churches. This or that is supposed to happen, this or that is not supposed to happen. A minister is supposed to be this kind of a person. Don't lay hands on anyone hastily. If there are these requirements, then there also has to be somebody that's making sure they're carried out. And that requires some kind of a process of quality control that the church has to have. There has to be a quality control process. We call that visitation a lot of times. So that's another doctrine that's derived from the text, but if you don't have that doctrine that's derived from it, you're not going to be able to fulfill these other ones. Now, maybe there'd be a way to have quality control, and you're not going to have the district president come around and talk with you in your congregation. There might be other ways to do that, but maybe not. So a lot of times the text of Scripture, as you're thinking about the doctrines, will then say, it'll point out to you that other practices ought to be done so that we're able to do what this says here. And sometimes there's more than one way to skin a cat, but there ought to at least be a skinned cat, right? Okay. You understand that, my Slavic friend? Okay, good. I've been here long enough. Let's see, number 9. I think that's pretty clear. That one's clearly just stated straight up in the text. Oh, this is not, however. Okay, so the gift of refuting adversaries. For the apostle wants a minister of the church to Tous ante legontas elenchein, refute those who contradict. Therefore, an accurate understanding of the controversies is necessary to this business, so that things are not condemned when they have simply been heard by others, but when they have been read in the writings of the adversaries, pondered and examined according to the rule of the Holy Scripture. From all these things it is understood that he who wants to discharge these parts of the ministry correctly must not conduct his studies in a way that is simply perfunctory, but with the highest exertion of the mind and an earnest plea for divine aid. For excellent teaching is necessary along with the highest wisdom, as is also an understanding of the arts that heretics use to disguise their deceptions, as is the study of philosophy and languages, without which nothing excellent is accomplished in theological study. So one of the things that the Pietists hated about the Orthodox is that they spent way too much time in polemics. And I think what you see here with Balduin, a generation before, is Paul actually commands that there should be refuting those who contradict the true doctrine. That requires the study of polemics. Number 10 is also, I think, a good doctrine that comes from this. The church is never entirely cleansed of false teachers. If in the apostolic era they had problems, it's likely that we're going to have problems too. If Paul himself wasn't able to clean things up in Crete and had to leave some of the work for Titus to do, it's pretty clear that even in the best of our congregations, there's always going to be troubles and problems. Okay. We know this from experience, but this at least shows us that it's right to believe that this is correct. This is interesting, not really as a deduction of doctrine from the text, but just because it kind of goes against what a lot of us have been taught. And I'm not saying he's right, but maybe he is. The principal duty of the ministry is to reprove, to shut the mouth of the one who contradicts, and sternly to rebuke seducers. What do you think? Is it too strict?
I would imagine he uses the word seducers a bit more broadly than we usually do.
Yes. We might say misleaders, people who mislead people into false belief, despair, and other great shame and vice.
There are pastors who try to never do that because it's seen as polemic, and I want to be positive, not negative.
In our day and age, this is a clear challenge to probably most pastoral care in America, and probably a lot of pastoral care, probably even in our synod. However, it could be, I think, misapplied, and I think what you get with C.F.W. Walther is generations of seeing this misapplied, and so that's where he really focuses on how necessary it is for the gospel to predominate. Likewise, early Luther, after generations of just having the law hammered on him all the time, he's like, really the most important thing is to preach the gospel and to console people with the forgiveness of sins and things of that sort.
Does he mean something by the principal duty that, that almost seemed to me to say the chief duty, but am I misunderstanding the word principal?
No, I think you're right. Principal would mean chief.
I think it's Walther that says excommunication should not be a mark of the church, or lack of church discipline should not, something similar to that. Does that seem warm?
Yeah, what you're referring to is where if a church for some reason, or if a pastor is not able to carry out church discipline in the fullness of how it ought to be, that doesn't mean it ceases right then and there to be the true church. However, it's more of a situation, I would add, more like if you've got an autoimmune deficiency, that doesn't mean you die automatically, but you sure are more liable to death. It's likely you'll die a lot sooner than if your immune system is working.
I highly commend, it's either the end, the final pages of Gerhard on the Ministry Part 1 or Gerhard on the Ministry Part 2. He does a fantastic job of explaining heretics and how to deal with heretics. So just some Gerhard accompaniment to this as well.
That would be another great book to read. Let's see. This is interesting. You can tell that he really loves his classics. Occasionally to mingle some things from the writings of the pagans with sacred sayings is both licit and useful, by the example of our Paul, who intended by references of this kind more easily to convict the Gentiles to whom he wrote of their error and to lead them to the knowledge of the truth. Okay, I think we've seen enough of this. You kind of get the sense of what's going on here.
It seems that this is helpful because, like, he's taken some. I mean, it's not the right way to say it, but he's taken some chances by drawing implications. But they're helpful things, so we can pick at them. And I think he overspoke when he said the principal duty of the ministry. But some of the commentaries that we're producing now are having to be so careful to pass so many hurdles that they just can't get out and actually say what they want to say. They're just so careful. And therefore it's given rise to, I'm safe to quote these other commentaries, and then I've quoted them. But here you're not getting a lot of quotations. He's just saying, you can draw this inference, this.
In this section, that's exactly what he's doing. In the previous section where he's explaining the text, so he's got the explanation of the text, the questions, and now the aphorisms. In the first section there, he does actually quote a lot of sources, but most of them are, he quotes a lot of early church fathers, like early patristic exegesis, he quotes a lot of. And then he'll quote in the question section the exegesis, especially of Roman Catholic or Reformed Bible commentators who would understand the text differently than he would. So that's the kind of use of other sources that he would use. But you're right, here when it comes to this part, now he's got a Chrysostom quote here, but I think that when he does that, it's more of illustrating his point. And he wouldn't need to have this Chrysostom quote. He's just making the assertion on the basis of the text itself. Yeah. Okay, shall we look at the gospel reading for this coming Sunday? Which should we look at first? The 1-year series or the 3-year series? Everybody vote for 1 year, raise your hand. Everybody who wants to vote for 3-year series, raise your hand. Okay, well, we'll do the 1-year series and then we'll see whether we want to do the 3-year later on. No, you know what? We're going to look at Gerhard on the 1-year series. We're going to look at Gerhard on the 1-year series. So let's do the 3-year. Okay, let's see. What is the 3-year this time?
Matthew 16, the confession of Peter.
When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell, Hades, shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." To 20? Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ. I think we might want to get the New King James up here as well. I'm sorry, the King James, so that we can see the distinction between first and second singular and second plural. So here's our exercise. What do we see as far as doctrines that we would derive from this?
I can't think of any.
None? All right, I've got to find a piece.
This isn't a passage dealt with very much in Reformation theology.
Yeah, you're right. So we already have a lot of doctrine that rides on this passage as it is. Book of Concord deals with this at some length. Okay, so besides the fact that we can say based on other passages of Scripture or based on the context that Christ, when he says that the kingdom of heaven is, or the keys are given to you, upon this rock I will build my church, etc., that this is not built on Peter as a person, but built on his confession or the ministry of his confession. Let's say that we already know that from the Lutheran confessions. What else can we say about this? What else is there?
Efficacy of the forgiveness of sins on earth as it is in heaven.
Okay.
Confession and absolution.
All right, so we'll say confession and absolution, certainly something that can be taught here, and probably church discipline. This is where he talks about the keys, right?
Yep.
Okay, so the keys is based very, very clearly right here.
How about the person and work of Christ?
All right. Maybe more specifically, his divine person, right?
Does that use Gehenna or?
You were asking about Gehenna, right? Or Hades. Verse 18. Hadu. Right there, Hadu, Hades. Netherworld. I don't know. Okay, so let's think here. Let's look at this. We basically just have to let's take maybe 5 minutes, read through it, and think about it, and then we'll see what doctrines we're going to see if we can derive from this. I hope this exercise is good. It's kind of failing right now. Let's take 5 minutes.